A burning planet, abortion restrictions, and weapons of war in schools were the issues top of mind as young voters headed to the polls in this year's midterm elections. Though pundits, pollsters, and professional voting strategists flat out ignored Gen Z and young millennials. But boy, were they wrong. These young voters turned out in droves, and they voted in large numbers for pro-democracy candidates from Georgia to Pennsylvania to Wisconsin to California. What does it mean for the next presidential election and even some tight local elections that are still going on? Are Gen Zs the next baby boomers when it comes to voting, or will they even surpass the voting block of baby boomers? All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
My first guest this morning is Kay Kawashima Ginsburg. She is the Newhouse Director of Circle. Good morning, Kay.
Good morning.
First, help us understand what Circle is. I have somewhat of a notion, but I'd love for you to tell us.
Sure. Circle actually stands for the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. And we are a nonpartisan research center based at Tufts University that focuses on how young people become active and lifelong engaged citizens contributing to the community. So we study election and voting, but also things like civic education in schools.
Wow, I love that. And obviously the youth have been the biggest news stories coming out of the midterm elections. Mm-hmm. Why is it, do you think, that pollsters and pundits and mainstream media kind of slap, I'll call it, on the youth vote, given that they were pretty strong voters in 2018, 2020 as well? What happened this election cycle that made folks pretty much dismiss them?
Areva, I cannot agree with you more. So it's now 3 cycles in a row where young people have come out in historic highs, even more than the Gen Xers, even sometimes more than the boomers, who are supposed to be the highest engaged generation. So 3 is now a pattern. So we've been sort of saying that for a while, that we need to sort of we need to really stop crediting young people when they really help Democrats win. That's not why young people are engaged. They're really, really coming in to vote for the candidate that they care about, that they feel are accountable to their needs based on that, not because they're Democrats or because they're Republicans. And I think sometimes we have been sort of undervaluing young people's voice and instead thinking of them as a tool to win as a party or the other. So that notion of young people not knowing enough to decide what they want to do for their communities and their country really haven't gone away yet. And we're really fighting the stereotype all the time.
Yeah, I wonder, does it date back even to the election, the Bernie Sanders election? Because it was in that election where we saw this massive deployment of youth at these rallies. Bernie Sanders, probably even more so than Donald Trump, could turn out tens of thousands of people. And then at the ballot box, there was this notion that they showed up at the rallies, but they didn't show up to vote. Was that true? Even when Sanders ran the first time, was it true that youth voters did not show up to vote for him, even though they were obviously engaged with him and were showing up at his rallies?
Right. So we have to always remember, though, kind of the band of really active young people have expanded greatly. So, for example, about 5% of young people used to participate in marches every year. Now we're up to like 27%. Last time we surveyed young people in 2020. So that's the kind of young people that would come out to also the rallies and the protests and then come on the campaign trail. At the same time, young people are still largely moderates and independents. So when a candidate is still not able to really cover much wider bandwidth of young people who may be less progressive than Bernie Sanders fans and supporters, then they're still not able to attract a large number of young people to say, I really believe in this candidate and I want to come out. Young people did kind of have their will not, let me try it again. Young people in the 2016 primaries really wanted Bernie Sanders as a group, but as a general electorate of young people, they're more moderate. So when it came to the general election, not enough young people were able to really engage with Hillary Clinton in that campaign. We also found in that year the investment in youth mobilization and voter registration was direly lacking. There is some notion maybe on the Democratic campaign side to assume because there were a lot of progressive young people coming to Bernie Sanders' campaign, they would automatically like Hillary Clinton. So there was a lot of issues with really whether campaigns really see young people as connoisseur of candidates and political topics and issues instead of thinking of them as, well, we'll just assume they'll come out to vote because we're Democrats. And that's never going to be true here, I think.
But it's interesting that you said young voters are more moderate and independent rather than being party loyalists, like baby boomers. We tend to identify either as Democrats or Republicans. Now, obviously, there's a group of folks who are baby boomers who identify as independents. But we do know from like 1999 up until very recently, youth voters were evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. We saw that in a recent study.
Yep.
Now, I've seen a number that says 63% of youth voters vote Democratic. Is that inconsistent with your research?
So they do end up supporting Democratic candidates who now are proposing lots of policies like gun safety policies, protecting the right for abortion care choices, and also, of course, the climate. So they're really fighting for their freedom and their community safety collectively, individually. And sometimes that kind of policy ideals is held by Republicans. They would probably actually vote for them. The data I'm citing is really about the party identification. So right now they're voting majority for Democratic candidates. But when you ask them, do you identify actually as a Democrat or Republican or something else? Even among voters this year, the exit polls showed that the under 30s, 40% of them said that they're Democrats, but 38% also said they're independent. And then only 22% said they're Republicans. So there's a difference in what they think in terms of their ideology. They're progressive, they're liberal, but they're not bought into the party politics.
It's interesting because I'm thinking about Gen Z and church. Like many of them say they're spiritual, but they don't want to be affiliated with a denomination. Like they don't want to be Catholic or Baptist or Methodist, but they say they're spiritual. They don't like labels. So they don't want to be Democrat or Republican. They just want to be, like you said, issue focused. But I did see, Kay, exit poll that said when they broke the youth vote down by ethnicity, and they looked at the Black youth vote, the Latino youth vote, and they looked at white, although white isn't an ethnicity. They broke it down by race, I should say. Black voters, youth voters, were 87% Democratic voters. That white voters, youth, were, I think the stat was somewhere around just slightly over 50%.
Yeah, 57.
Yeah, 57% Democratic, and then the other percentage were Republican. Why do you see that big spread between like Black youth voters and white youth voters?
This kind of difference actually has been present for a long time among the youth electorate as well as the general electorate. If anything, the gap between the white voters' Democratic support and Black and Latinx youth voters' Democratic support has shrunk in the last 3 cycles. It was bigger in 2016 election when white voters actually preferred Donald Trump by not a huge but healthy margin. I think by 10 points. Now they're kind of swinging the other way. So they're the weakest supporter of Democratic candidates, but the majority support is coming from white youth too. And at the same time, young white women, their support for Democratic candidates in this year's election was especially big, and pretty big gap was seen between young white women and young white men.
And
there's a lot of
Okay, because I saw another stat that said white women by 8 points were favoring Republican candidates. Was that white women over 30? Because what you just said is that white women were, by larger margins supporting Democratic candidates. So that 8% figure, that applies to women over 30.
Yeah, so our data, which does look at the same exit poll, but for the 18 to 29, says 71% of young women. I'm actually, sorry, no, that's not it. Oh, I don't know if I can find it right now. Oh, I found it. Okay. Let me do it again. So our exit poll data, which comes from the same data, but limited to 18 to 29, says that 64% of young white women prefer Democratic candidates. Okay. So that's still a pretty big preference there compared to young white men who's not giving the same. But just a slim margin, still Democratic support.
I guess that's what, how we've seen that as, I guess, voters get older, as you said, those white older women tend to become more Republican or vote more Republican. I'm thinking of the attack on young single women that we saw on Fox after the election, and some of their hosts saying, these single women need to get married because, they'd be more grounded. And I guess the thinking would be they would marry a white man and then they would become Republican like their white male spouses. It was so incredibly offensive, it was offensive and ridiculous to suggest that white women under 29 couldn't make their own decisions and choices about who to vote for, that they needed to be married. And that's what brings me to, I know you're nonpartisan, but the Republican Party, if these trends are to continue, will have a very difficult time in any future election winning elections, because that Gen Z population is just going to continue to grow. And as you get more Gen Z voters eligible to vote, if they continue to trend in this direction and Republicans continue to not embrace the issues like gun control, reproductive freedom, climate control, if they continue with these very niche and base kinds of issues like get married, don't have abortions, have more guns, what does that mean for the Republican Party, in your opinion, going forward?
It's really difficult to imagine how they're going to make up by proposing a series of policies that the young activists continue to say they're harmful to their generation, to the planet, and for the future generations. So if you think about the abortion policies and bans on abortion, it really keeps many, many women to be able to continue to pursue education, continue to pursue career if they're not able to have that choice for themselves. And to have that personally affecting many thousand, if not hundreds of thousands of families and women right now, it's going to have that long-lasting impact on what they remember about the Republican parties. And our data often suggests that the Republican parties already don't reach out to young people compared to the Democratic Party. So they're not explaining themselves about why they would be saying anything like that on the Fox News, or why they're proposing such policies and try to make way to the younger generation. So now, regardless of what rationale they might have to these policies they're proposing and what they're saying about young women, I have no idea. But if they had a really good place they're coming from, they also don't have a chance to get to know that because they're not talking to young people. So they have a lot to lose and not doing much about it right now.
Right, not talking to engaging. And they never seem to follow their autopsies, even after the data is clear on what they need to do to change. Do you think, though, if we'll see a difference as those 18 to 29-year-old women, let's say they do get married when they're in their 30s and they marry white Republican men, does your research suggest that we'll see more of those now Gen Zers who are voting Democratic become Republican as they mature themselves, get married, have a house, have property taxes, and all the things that happen to you when you become a real adult? And not to suggest that they're not real adults, I don't want to say that, but just as you become more mature.
I hear you. So the traditional and older longitudinal political science research suggests that the people do, in fact, become more Republican voting as they age. At the same time, Gen Z and younger millennials really have been breaking all the patterns of political science findings, like they're staying more progressive as younger millennials age into 30s, for example. And the other side, kind of the political science research also says the first 3 times that you vote and kind of which party that you support kind of becomes your lifelong commitment. So Gen Zs that are kind of now 18 to 24 block are right on their way to sort of becoming the consistent progressive voters. So that sort of suggests 2 things. They may, of course, as they age, turn more Republican, but they're starting out so much more Democratic than the previous generation have been. Like you said, they used to be half and half divided. Now, that generation, like Gen X, is getting older, sort of the Republican side's winning. But that's because they started half and half, potentially. So if they follow the trajectory that they are to sort of 2-to-1 margin right now, even if they age older, they're probably still changing what the American politics looks like. Lastly, we have to remember this is a generation that's far more diverse than other generation. So the electorate that just turned eligible, 18 to 19-year-old this year, were 46% people of color. Wow. And that's a very different makeup of population than we might assume American electorate has looked like for decades.
Yeah, that brings me to this video of Lindsey Graham that went viral. And he, begging people to vote for Herschel Walker in this Georgia Senate race and saying that Democrats are afraid that if Herschel Walker wins, he's going to appeal to Black voters, young Black voters in particular, to become Republican. That doesn't seem to be borne out by anything that Black people know, but definitely even borne out by your data that it's not going to be any personal appeal that Herschel Walker or any Republican candidate can make, because these youth voters are going to be looking at what are your policies. And if your policies aren't aligned with their, ideology, they're not going to vote for you.
Exactly. And I think voters of colors, especially younger voters where we study, are really tired of being assumed about who they are based on their race, right? Of course, there are some real things that come with their race, like discrimination and all that. At the same time, they don't want to be assumed, well, you're Black, you're going to be Democratic, or you're Latina, so you're going to vote for a Democratic candidate, no matter what they say or what they're doing or how little they talk to you. They're asking candidates to actually come talk to them and listen to their priority and what's important for them today and for their futures of the community. And I think the candidate who can do that, whether it's a Republican candidate or Democratic candidate, have a much better chance than saying, I'm Black, vote for me, right? That's really undervaluing what voters know and think about political leaders.
Yeah, that whole tenor of the Herschel Walker campaign has been troubling, I know, to African Americans, this notion that somehow because Herschel Walker or even Raphael Warnock, either of them in this Senate race, that they should get the votes of any group, particularly Black people, because they're Black. And we know that the policies that Herschel Walker and the Republican Party support are not aligned with, as you just said, where most Black voters are, like reproductive freedom. That's so huge because Black women have such high maternal mortality rate. So abortion care is not just abortion care, it's health care, it's life care. And when Republicans have these policies, no exceptions for serious illnesses or injuries, or no exceptions for rape or incest, that is totally, diametrically opposed to what the Black community feels is in our own best interest. So I don't see how Herschel Walker or anyone overcomes that. Before I let you go, what is motivating the registration of young voters? Because even though you said, Kay, that Republicans aren't investing in young voters, I've had so many people on my show who have said, look, they're going into college campuses, they're going into some of these battleground states to register young voters. What motivates a young voter to even register? I mean, how do you get them to register? Even before we get to the polls, you got to be registered.
Yeah. So, it's actually pretty hard to register in some states because you have to have a certain set of paperwork with you in order to be able to register. So even when the students are at college and they're in one place and they're convenient to talk to in many ways, but if they don't have a driver's license or utility bill or even birth certificate in some cases, they can't register. So really the easiest and best is actually just automatically register them when they come into the role at the driver's license bureau or some colleges even. So
but we know, okay, hold on, I want to stop you because we know Republicans aren't interested in registering these voters because they have the same data that you have. So they know these are not their voters. So we know in some of these states, there's the intentional effort to suppress the registration of the youth vote because they know it's not their vote. So how are organizations getting around that?
So there's many ways. So first is, of course, young people registering each other. There is pretty high rate of young people. I think about a quarter of young people saying, I registered my friends. And that's really one big defense against these measures and confusion and campaigns that really make young people think that, oh, maybe it's not worth my time, or maybe my votes don't matter. It's really the friends that they trust that can tell them, no, it does matter. You should be on record, but as a voter, and here's how you register, and guide them through that. There's lots of different laws. So the more the friends can help each other in their neighborhood and their school, the better. There are, of course, youth organizations on the ground in the community. Like in Georgia, there's many of them, like New Georgia Project and others, who are really there every day of the year instead of just election time, and talking to them all the time about why it's important for them to care and why they matter as a community member. And then in the process, finally convince them to also register. So we can't just rush young people to just believe in the election or in their votes in one day necessarily, but it's really important that there's kind of education and encouragement and invitation going around to all sorts of young people, not just on college campuses, but even in high schools, for teachers to talk about, it's really important to vote. Let's teach you how to register so you all have the knowledge, and then continue to encourage them to do that. Young people have to believe in their agency.
That's so important. Just real quickly, Kay, if I live in California and I'm going to school in Texas, do I register in California and get my ballot sent to me in Texas, or have my parents send it to me and then send it back to California? Is that how college voting works?
It really depends on the state. So I don't want to make a blanket statement for that, but both of those things are often option in multiple states. Some students will choose to register in the state of their residence, because oftentimes they just have to live there for 30 days. So they can do that, or they can request ballot directly from their permanent address's election office and then have it sent to their parents. And yes, the parents can send it to them. Sometimes college campuses can help you figure that out, because it can be a little complicated.
Yeah, but I guess the key is you shouldn't be voting in two states. So you have to choose your home state or your college state. Yep. Great information. I think one of the biggest lessons for me, Kate, coming out of the midterms is I want to take back every time I call Gen Zs a snowflake, because I'm sorry, Gen Z, they held democracy, they held the blue wall. And I'm thinking of all of my baby boomer critique of them as not being ambitious enough and being soft and weak. I'm sorry. I adore you. I'm encouraged, I'm inspired by, your agency, the use of your agency. And I think all of us who are, not in the Z generation, not in the millennial generation, we have to rethink how we talk about and characterize these young voters, these young leaders, because we want to encourage rather than disincentivize them from civic engagement and civic participation. So thank you for the work that you guys are doing at Circle and getting this valuable data, getting it out. Hopefully campaigns are getting this data. Candidates who are thinking of running, this is important data for them to have as well. And folks like me with a platform, it helps me atone for my critique of Gen Zs. They're my new best friends. I love them. So again, thanks so much for joining me this morning, Kay, and keep up the great.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, my next guests are members of the Gen Z population. It's Anya Ramos. She's a digital organizer of Leaders Igniting Transformation. And Santiago Mayer. He's the executive director of Voters of Tomorrow. And you guys, Anya and Santiago, you heard my full-throated apology because I have been guilty of counting you guys out, even though I'm the parent of two Gen Z young adults who are actively engaged in their respective ways. So first of all, just thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for using your voices and being the leaders of today and tomorrow. I want to start with you, Santiago. I know you've been everywhere working on registering voters and turning out young voters. What was the biggest issue that motivated what we now know to be the 28% or so turnout amongst Gen Z and voters under 29?
Yeah, listen, when we talk about what Gen Z believes in, we really center it around freedom, around liberty, and around autonomy. And we have seen over the past few years, all of those concepts really come under attack, both from the Supreme Court decision on Dobbs that overturned the right to an abortion, to different governors trying to ban books or even telling teachers what they can or can't teach in schools. And I think we really saw Gen Z finally say enough is enough. We're going to fight for our rights. We're going to fight for freedom. We're going to fight for democracy, and we're going to stop this. And that's really what drove this energy to the polls.
Anya, do you agree with Kay that your generation of voters don't tend to identify by party as Democrats or Republicans, but you are more issues driven? Is that accurate based on the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I work with youth. I'm a youth myself, but throughout my work, I work with youth. And even with my peers, they honestly feel like politicians lie to them. And so when they think of why do I want to vote, we kind of focus it around what matters to you, what is the future that you want to live in? Because at the end of the day, we are the future. So thinking of what do you want to live in? What does the life that you want look like? That's what you have to vote for. That's what you have to fight for. And it starts with education and then action following.
Santiago, Anya raises a good point. A lot of youth, a lot of older people believe that politicians lie, and they become disillusioned with the process. Some become even apathetic. So when you confront a young voter that says, well, Biden promised he was going to eliminate student loan debt, and we're into the second year of his term, and when he does it, it's not the amount that they had expected or wanted, and now you see it's being held up in court. Some youth voters says, well, why vote? I voted for the guy and he promised me X and he didn't deliver on X. How do you combat that when you hear that from a youth voter, a potential youth voter?
Yeah, I think there's several things here. I mean, the first one is obviously we need to make sure that young voters understand the system in which we live, because at the end of the day, yes, it can be very frustrating that the courts are stopping student debt relief. But that is not something that the president can control. And Joe Biden did deliver, and it might not have been the amounts that we expected, but he did deliver some student loan relief. And he is continuing to fight to get it to the court. So I think having that educational component is incredibly important. I will also say, though, that although as a generation and we are independent, we also are very progressive and we are pragmatic. And I think those three words really signify what Gen Z is as a whole. Because yes, we have these big ideas and we have these big goals, but we also understand that we can't do everything at once, that there is a process to getting things done, and that we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. And as we are continuing to fight all of these battles on so many fronts, we really can't stop to just sit down and be like, well, I didn't get everything that I wanted, so I'm just going to stay home. We really have to keep showing up until we do get everything that we want, and until we do get all our rights back, and until we do stop all of these attacks.
See, I knew I loved you guys for a reason. I love that you said you're progressive and you're pragmatic. That is like me every day of the week. I consider myself a pragmatic progressive. I'm progressive, but I understand processes and I understand, what it takes to get legislation passed. And of course, I've been here a little longer than you guys. So there's a reason that I think I understand it a little better than some in your generation. But how do you confront that, Anya? Because I've had a lot of youth voters on my show and they say, he lied. He didn't get this done. He promised us this. And he could have, done something about the Dobbs decision. And people don't know civics. They don't understand the legislative process. They don't understand the numbers about how many senators you have to get a bill passed, or how many folks you have to have in Congress. So how do you combat that lack of civics education that so many people in this country, particularly young people, have missed out on?
That is such a great point. Definitely the education system is lacking with civic education. So with Leaders Igniting Transformation, we are nonpartisan. And so we focus on education and also action. So of course, I personally believe that it starts with teaching people what this looks like, how this works, and how you can be a part of it. And then when young people start to realize, okay, this is how this works. This is not as confusing as I thought it was. I just was unaware. Then that's where the action starts to come in. And maybe it's not only voting, because yes, voting does make a very, very significant impact. However, it has to be year-round work. So, once you educate the youth, then that youth now educates another youth. And it just goes into a cycle of, okay, I understand this. Now I'm going to teach others. And then you just keep going and then making action, making change, demanding change from policymakers. When you see stuff on the ballot, that's great. But if it doesn't happen, what do? Go email those legislators, go outside of these buildings, please, on social media, just make your voice heard, pretty much. And that's what I like to teach. That's what I was taught. Make your voice heard, but also educate and, know that there's a process, because there absolutely is. And you can't always win every single thing. However, I think it's important to fight for and push for the change that you feel like you deserve in your future. And that's pretty much what I do to combat just that lack of understanding.
And I love that you're talking about accountability. And you're right. It's not just our job to show up at the polls on election day and vote. We have to stay engaged. We have to hold our elected officials accountable. And when they do veer from what they promised, we have to be there to remind them by using our voices, by using email, by using social media, by going into their offices and actually sitting down and meeting with them, by sometimes staging nonviolent protests. So there are lots of things that we can do to hold our elected officials accountable. Santiago, I do want to talk about the use of social media. Anya brought that up. We know in this digital age, there was this big concern that Elon Musk was going to buy Twitter right before the elections. And he did go tweet out to his hundreds of millions of followers to vote Republican. And there was fear that he was buying Twitter for the very purpose of trying to undermine democracy and to help defeat Democratic candidates. Why do you think it didn't work? If that was the plan? Some say it's a conspiracy theory, but he obviously said vote Republican, and people like you and your generation didn't listen to him. Why do you think it failed?
Yeah, listen, I'm an avid Twitter user. Most of my beginning in politics happened due to Twitter. And I have been very concerned just because this platform that I've gotten so much from is now in the verge of dying. I think that the main reason that this really didn't have its intended effect on the elections is really coordinated effort, not just by youth organizations, but by the pro-democracy coalition at large to combat these disinformation narratives and really put out reliable, trustworthy, verifiable information that people could rely on. And we saw that across the board. And we even pushed Twitter to push back a new verification policy. We got them to add a second verified batch, because we were just going in circles here, to some of the official news channels and news sources to really make sure that we had reliable sources of information that people could consult. And because of that, you never really saw what I think was the worst case scenario, which was you would have all these verified accounts spewing this information. You wouldn't be able to tell who was saying what. Did this politician say this? Does this other politician say that? That we never really got to that point. I think we kind of stopped at the comedy portion of it when everyone was pretending to be Elon Musk. So I think that was a big factor of it. I also do want to give credit to young voters specifically, because many people discount them as not being particularly smart, but I think young voters are way smarter than most people think. I think Gen Z specifically can tell when something is fake, can tell when a account is being impersonated. And we saw that, and we saw young voters not fall for this disinformation. I think that's something worth highlighting.
Very good point. And Anya, to that point of young voters being smart, I'm sure you saw the campaign on Fox after the death of the red wave, and comments by some hosts that young single women are the problem and they need to get married, because if they were married, they would make smarter voting choices. How do you, as a young woman, respond to something like that? This notion that in 2022 that we're not smart enough, or you're not smart enough as a young woman to make your own decisions.
It's absolutely ridiculous. I think I know I'm definitely smart enough, and I know there are so many other women out there that are, and also people who are, that don't need a man or any partner to tell them what to do, how to think, how to vote. I can directly say I don't need someone to make me make an opinion. I'm actually helping people form their own opinions by educating them. So I know I'm very well educated, and I know there are so many other people out there that are. And I think that's just a very dumb notion to just throw that out there and just be like, hey, like, you need to have someone to tell you what to do or think what you need to think because I'm irritated with the decision that you made. Like, no, come on now. Like, just because you don't like the decision doesn't mean that it's not their decision to make. So I think
I'm glad to hear you push back on that. I found it so offensive and so, I don't know, 1950s, anachronistic. Santiago, I want to ask you, great wins, obviously. We're celebrating Gen Z voters. We know what you did in so many states. But let's talk about what didn't happen. Disappointments. I was so disappointed in the election in Texas. Uvalde. I can't think of anything that would have been more of an incentive, a driver for folks to go to the polls and vote out the governor of Texas, who has made guns more accessible, who's, supporting DNA kits for kids rather than sensible gun laws. And Beto O'Rourke, who has staked his whole career on fighting for gun control legislation, got beat pretty badly. So, and I think I read a stat like 9 million people didn't even vote in Texas. What was the organizing like amongst your generation in Texas? And why can't a candidate like Beto break through in a state that has been riddled with gun violence in schools and in nightclubs and in public spaces?
Yeah, listen, I think there's a variety of factors here. We organized, especially in college campuses, in order to get out the vote, make sure college students were voting. We also did some organizing in high schools. Earlier in the year, we distributed copies of banned books with voter registration cards so high school seniors could register to vote. But I think that one of the biggest factors here is the fact that, unfortunately, the state government is trying to suppress the youth vote and is trying to suppress the vote at large. We saw in Texas A&M the fact that they literally removed early polling places from the university, and it kind of led to a coalition of organizations, including Voters of Tomorrow, to fund buses to try and take college students from campus to an off-campus voting location. And this was not the only school where it happened. And you saw that and things like that really across the state. And that obviously does have an effect on turnout rates. I also do want to point out, I think Greg Abbott and maybe Ron DeSantis are the perfect examples that show that the politics of fear actually do work. And there is a segment of the population that will turn out to vote only if they are scared about about Mexicans coming into the borders, about the sand pits in the classroom or third grade classrooms or whatever Joe Rogan is talking about on his podcast this week. And when you have those people activated, you really need a even larger presence of sane, rational, kind people to also show up to vote. And we saw that activation, but we really didn't see that response. And in large part, that is because of voter suppression, but also just the infrastructure is simply not there. And that is something that we have been working on, that I know other organizations have been working on. But you need people on the ground who are able to continually invest and talk with the community and be parts of the community and understand how everything is set up in the state. And that simply doesn't exist right now. It doesn't exist in Texas. It doesn't exist in Florida. And that is dragging down our candidates, and something that we definitely have to fix either before 2024, or at least before 2026.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up 2024 because, Anya, Donald Trump threw his hat back in the ring last night and says he's all in. And the pundits are saying he's likely to be the candidate selected by the Republican Party because the base, despite the shellacking that the party really took at the midterms, that the base is still solidly behind him. What do you think happens in 2024 with the youth vote if Donald Trump does break through and is the Republican candidate for president?
I guess I would just piggyback off of just like that fear side of how politics work. I think it's definitely going to cause an upbringing of just more action, more vocalization. But yeah, the work is definitely not done. I think youth definitely need to just be involved in whatever sense they believe in. I just feel like definitely there's going to be much more youth turnout, even though we've already seen historic turnout in the past few years, which is absolutely mind-blowing, and it's crazy to be a part of it. But I think it's just going to keep growing. And I think we're going to see a lot of changes, honestly.
Yeah. How are you feeling, Santiago, about going into 2024? And with that, I also want you to address, what does the chattering class do now that you, for the third time, the 2018, the 2020, now the 22 election, you have proven that the youth vote is powerful, and we should stop ignoring the vote. What do you want pollsters and strategists to know going into 2024?
Listen, I'm feeling great about 2024. I think the only person that likes to see Donald Trump lose more than me is Donald Trump. We have defeated him in 2018, 2020, 2022. We're going to defeat him again in 2024. And I think what that really goes to prove is that the pundits and the pollsters and the forecasters and all of these people that talk about elections for a living really need to reconsider what likely voters mean. Because when you look at registered voter polls, they were not that off. The issue was with their interpretation of which of those voters were actually going to show up. And they miscounted women and they miscounted young voters. And I think it's well beyond time for them to start realizing that young voters are likely voters, and that if they want to forecast an election, they have to account for young people showing up. So if Donald Trump wants another go around, we're here for it, and young voters will hand him a big loss again.
Yeah, good point, Santiago. I always wonder, do young people answer poll questions when they call you or they email you or they try to text you? Someone told me that young people ignore those posters because they purposely don't want to, they want to be more mysterious about their vote. They want to be the surprise element. Do you think a little of that is happening with younger voters?
There's a mix. I don't know if it's that coordinated where we want to keep it mysterious, but there's definitely a factor of young voters not answering their phones or not replying to texts. There are a few agencies that specialize specifically on polling young voters. I mean, the Harvard Institute of Polling with John de la Volpe does a biannual youth survey that actually is quite accurate in what young people say. At Voters of Tomorrow, we constantly poll young people to really understand what we're talking about and what policies we're advocating for. So there are outlets that specifically poll young people, but I think there is that big gap in public polling, especially political polling, where they simply can't reach young people and don't know how to.
And what's your message, Anya, for anyone that has written your generation off, anyone that, continues to believe you're not a reliable voter? They loop you into that low propensity voter characterization. Well, what's your message?
It's not true. We're going to keep fighting.
I love it. Yeah. I love it. Yeah, no, you guys have proven the experts wrong over and over again. I'm so incredibly proud of the work that you're doing. I applaud you. I hope that those dollars flow into your organizations, because we know organizing is expensive, but we also know talking to your neighbors and being that trusted messenger is how we motivate people to go to the polls and to register. So I'm hoping to see you guys on the trail in 2024, and it's going to be an interesting next 2 years now that the former president has decided that the way to avoid criminal indictment is to yet run for president again. So let's just call it what it is. Thank you so much, Santiago. Thank you so much, Anya, for the work that you're doing. Got to have you guys back as those elections heat up leading into 2024. All right. My next guest is Richard Green. He's the guy I've been wanting to talk to post midterm elections. And Richard, how are you feeling about what Santiago and Anya and youth around this country did? They held the blue wall. They prevented the red wave from becoming reality.
First of all, I have to say Santiago is a hero. He is, by the way, an immigrant. Even more special that he would come to America and help save our country. Thank you, Santiago. And we were joking before. He goes, I don't really care about what grade I get in college. I don't care if I get a C. And I said, yeah, you're going to go for your job interview. He said, oh my God, Mr. Mayor, you only have a C average. He said, oh, but I see that you saved the United States democracy. Well, I think you're good.
Wow. Okay. But, why, Richard, does your class, the chattering class, the strategists, the pundits, why were they even written off given how they performed in 18 and 20?
Well, but hold on. I'm going to be a little contrary here. You know that. And I'm going to say something, and Santiago, if you're on, we'll talk afterwards. But young people didn't frickin' vote. They didn't.
When?
And the truth is that Gen Z did turn the tide to a large extent in very close races, because when they did vote, they voted overwhelmingly Democratic. But the number that I have, and I've not seen any other numbers, is that 18 to 29-year-olds in this critical midterm election, with the democracy on the line, with women's rights on the line, with gun violence on the line, with climate on the line, with all these other issues, turned out 27%. 27%. So that 27% figure includes the Gen Z up to like 25, plus 4 more years where you would have assumed there would be even higher participation, because as people get older, they tend to vote more. So I love Gen Z. It's fantastic, but they didn't vote even as much as young people in 2018. I don't get it.
No, and that, I don't know, Richard, I'm not going to let you critique the young people, because here's my response to that. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely, yes. But when you think about voter suppression, which Santiago talked about, when you think about the efforts that have been taken in some of these red states to make it more difficult for young people, and when you think about how we as adults, as Santiago and Anya says, haven't invested in the young vote, I don't know if we can complain about it.
Okay,
the Republican Party, I saw in articles that said they spend no money investing in young voters. So are we doing our jobs as adults before we, like really grown as adults, before we complain about what they didn't do?
Well, hold on. There is no question there is voter suppression. That is part of the playbook. That's part of the survival strategy of the Republican Party, is they do not have any issues. As Anya was talking about, what are the issues you care about? Get out and vote for that. They have literally almost none of them for young people with more liberal progressive values. But for God's sakes, one of the big stories today is that Taylor Swift crashed the internet because young people, desperate to see her live again, took days off work to go try to get a ticket. And I'm saying, with all due respect, I love Taylor Swift. She's very talented, and she came out, for the right people in Tennessee a few years ago. But for God's sakes, if you're going to do that to go to a 2.5-hour rock concert, why won't you do that to go and help determine the direction of our country for 2 full years? And the reason comes back to what you and I have talked about all the time. And I believe it's messaging. And I think the Democratic Party did a horrible job, I was going to say the S word, of actually messaging how voting would translate into getting their reproductive rights back, into getting better gun violence prevention legislation, into getting even better climate legislation. And I've got some stats that
But let
really
me say this, Richard. I'm going to agree. I agree that 27 to 31%, whichever number you take from 2018 to today, there's room for improvement. But I'm going to still give these young people a lot of credit, because what we haven't done, and I see this, and I talk to my kids about this, we're not investing in them. We've written them off as low propensity voters. And when you write someone off and you don't invest in them, then you can't realistically expect for them to turn out for the reasons you know are important to turn out. And we know people vote when they hear from trusted messengers. I had a 28-year-old on my radio show last week, and she said most of her friends don't vote because she says no one talks to them about voting. She grew up in a household where people talked about voting. So how are they learning? How are these young people that know Taylor Swift, who's talking to them? Not the slick political ads that they see on TikTok or Instagram, because that's not reaching people. So what are we doing as a party, Democratic Party, to reach these young voters?
Well, maybe you can help me on this, because I'm going to be having a conversation with some people in our party about spending the next 2 years to actually solve that problem, to actually teach them how the frickin' game works. And you mentioned before about the numbers. Voting is nothing more than understanding second grade arithmetic. It's all about numbers. If you want a certain thing, you got to get a certain number of people elected. It's not rocket science. And I say to people, they say, oh, Fortnite is such a great computer game. And if I went to go sit down and play Fortnite and I did not know how to play Fortnite, I didn't understand how to play the game, I didn't understand how to win the game, I'd be bored to death and I would say, this game sucks and I'm not doing it anymore. I had I want to share this. I have an incredible nephew. He just turned 18 in October.
Wonderful.
And I've been hammering, his name is Ethan. I've been hammering him for a year. And my brother and sister-in-law have been hammering him. And it's like, no, I don't know. If it doesn't take too much time, I'll think about it. I said, Ethan, for God's sakes. And then twice he pulled together some of his young friends and I went out to his house, drove out there and, said, I'll buy pizza. And I did the whole thing. And I gave the little civics class. And then after I was scared, the day after the election, I sent him a text, I said, Ethan, did you vote? And he goes, yeah. And then he said something. This is so powerful. I'm going to do a TikTok on it at Civics Dean. He goes, I felt like I was really an adult now.
All right,
How
Ethan.
Frickin' beautiful is that? Yay, Ethan.
Yes, go Ethan. But see what it took? It took you investing in Ethan and his friends. And that's what I'm saying. Are we doing this? I don't want to indict the party, but this is a question.
I do.
How much investment is being made in? I think not much, because I think everyone is bought into they are low propensity voters. And if you believe they're not going to vote, then you're not going to spend your money trying to get them to vote.
So, Areva, you and I are both lawyers, and we know that if you're going to swing a jury, you've got to present some credible arguments, some facts, and be compelling. I was begging Tim Ryan, begging so many other candidates in the DNC and the DSCC and the DCCC, just talk about the math. Don't just say, I'm going to go vote for reproductive rights and to restore Roe v. Wade. Say, I will be one of 2 senators that we need to get this over the finish line. We're on the 2-yard line. We only need 2 more. I'll be one of those 2. If you care about this issue, not only do you have to vote, you have to vote for me. Let me give you some stats to tell you why I'm so pissed off. Okay. Remember what I said, I've been saying all year with you. We just need to hold the House to restore Roe v. Wade, right? Women's Health Protection Act. We just need to hold the House and pick up how many more senators? 2, right? We're probably going to pick up 1, right? Pennsylvania, Georgia. We're probably going to be 51, which will be 1 short. Do you know how many votes we lost to Ron Johnson with Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin? Do you know how many votes?
No, how many?
26,000 votes.
Yeah, I knew it was low. Yeah.
So we were 20, which I believe that if the young people percentage was not 27%, I don't know exactly what it is in Wisconsin, but if it was 37%, we would have won in a landslide. So also, we're going to lose the House. I'm sure it's going to be called today. Do you know how many votes we're going to lose the House by? I did the math last night. 6,880.
Yeah.
So if you add the 26,000 plus 7,000, that's what? 33,000 votes in a country of 330 million people. Because not just young people didn't vote enough, everybody didn't vote enough. And the problem with the last point, the problem with the 27%, it's like, okay, that's the second most in history. Yay, young people, good job. But when older
Richard, that sarcasm is not going to help people.
I'm pissed. I'm allowed to be pissed. I have a first.
You are. Okay, go ahead. What do you want to say about these young people, Richard?
No, just the last. And again, I love Santiago, and Santiago and others worked their butts off. They couldn't have done more. But the Democratic Party needs to support that effort 10x for God's sakes. So what I want to say is 27% is low, but it's pitifully low. And so upsetting because older white people, my demographic, 65 and older, voted double that. One step forward, two steps back.
Okay. All right. But older white people have been on the earth, obviously, twice as long as these young people. And what I want to do, everything you're saying about young voters is true. There's room for improvement. But when they've done their second best, we've got to keep encouraging them, and we've got to show the party that it's worth investing in them. And now I'm going to tell you something really positive before I let you go. You would love my soon-to-be declared mayor of Los Angeles, Congresswoman Karen Bass, because she did exactly what you're talking about doing, Richard. She invested in Youth for Bass. And she didn't do it at the 11th hour. She did it at the beginning of her campaign. And she brought together young people, some people who weren't even old enough to vote, but got them engaged in the civic process of being a part of a campaign. She had them creating T-shirts and artwork. They did door knocking. They did phone calls. They rode the bus with us on a weekend where we did GOTV. And they got exposed to what it means to be a part of a campaign and to run a campaign. She had young people under 30 running her campaign, along with more seasoned, obviously, professionals. So there are individual candidates that get this, that get the importance of the young vote, that get the importance of engaging them around the electoral process. Do we need more of that? Absolutely, positively, yes. Do young organizers like Santiago and Anya, and my daughter, she's at Columbia. She says no one talked to the students on Columbia's campus about voting. So these young people need help. They don't need to be talked down to. We can't criticize them until we help them. So I'm going to reserve my critique, and I'm going to talk to us older people and say, look, get them some money, because organizing is expensive. You got to rent buses. Santiago said they had to pick people up on a bus and take them to different college campus. You got to pay door knockers. You've got to pay for polls. You got to pay for advertising on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. All that's very expensive. So don't expect young people to turn out when you've spent all your dollars courting those suburban white women. And we know Democrats are obsessed with suburban white women. I mean, I don't know what it is about it, but all we talk about is the suburban white women. So we spend all our money in the suburbs rather than on college campuses. Far be it for us to have complaints about these young voters. So when you talk to your Democratic pundits, Richard, and you're talking to these Democratic, leaders, tell them to stop focusing on those white women, because 46% of those Gen Z and young millennials are people of color. They tend to be progressive, as Kay told us in the first segment, and those are where their votes are. That's where their votes are.
I don't disagree. By the way, I'm going to go down to Georgia. I'm going to try to talk a little civics about the runoff, right? Because here's the point I want everyone to talk about when they talk about the runoff. We're not just electing Herschel Walker or Raphael Warnock for 2 years. We're electing them for 6. And at the end of those 6 years, Clarence frickin' Thomas is going to be in his 80s. What happens if we don't elect Raphael Warnock and that seat gets open on the Supreme Court and we do not have enough votes in the Senate to confirm someone like Ketanji Brown Jackson, and we get another Clarence Thomas for 40 years? For goodness sakes. I want to end with one positive note. I totally agree with you. My daughter, who was born on an election day, as it turns out. It was the only election that I missed because I was kind of busy. She's in New York. She's registered in LA. And about a week and a half before she got she said, Dad, I didn't get my absentee ballot. I'm really thinking about flying back to LA to vote. That's because when she was a baby, I would take her in the voting booth with me in my arms. I would let her push the buttons, and it was a cultural
Richard,
thing.
She's your daughter.
I know.
She had no choice. I'm taking my autistic son to vote. So people who live with you and me are going to be voters. But there are lots of kids who don't grow up in households where their parents are engaged civically. They don't talk. My 28-year-old guest last week told me her friends, their parents never talked about voting. They weren't taking them to vote with them. So they didn't get that at home. So we, again, I'm going to take responsibility. All of us have to make sure we're doing our part to pour into these young people because they've shown us, even with a little bit, look how much they've done. So imagine if we really invested in them.
100%. If we can get from 27,
I agree with you. We could win every election. I mean, if we
get from 20% to 30, 27 to 37 in the midterms, and we come close to older people in presidentials, we've changed the country. There is no way Republicans can win with that.
No way. And baby boomers, we got to move aside. Got to leave them some cash. Got to put some cash. Give them some advice when they ask, not unsolicited. They don't want to hear from us, but we've got to support them. Thank you, Richard. Always good to see you. Kudos to your daughter. I'm glad that meant so much that she would have flown home. I had to mail overnight my ballots to my daughters in New York so that they could vote. And I had to remind them. One daughter was going to Mexico. I'm like, do that ballot tonight. And then they did a TikTok where they both showed that they were voting. And so I expect nothing less of them, but they don't matter. We got to get to those kids who don't have you and I in their ears, making sure that they vote. And we'll do that. Because we're committed to it. We're going to win Georgia because you're going to go down there and talk to those college students. I'm excited about that. And go Karen Bass, Richard.
Listen, I am very happy for that result. I knew it would be super close because of all the people I knew. Oh, no,
you're doing a Fox News on me that said we didn't talk about a red wave. Y'all made that up. Now you're going to reverse and say you didn't say Karen was going to lose.
I did think that Caruso would pull it out. I was wrong, happily, but it was way closer than it was in the primary. That's all. No,
I think she'll be between 4% and 7%, and that's always what we thought, because white voters reliably voted for Rick Caruso. Affluent voters reliably voted for Rick Caruso. But you know who is making Karen Bass the mayor of Los Angeles? Those pragmatic progressives. And most
I love that term. I love that term.
That's what I am. I'm a pragmatic progressive. I got to run. Thank you. So good to see you, Richard.
Care.
All right. I want to thank all of my guests today. I am so stoked about these young voters because they may not have, gotten to 35% or 45% in this election, but think about what they can do in 2024. So if we don't write them off, if we don't just criticize them, but rather we invest in them and encourage them, they can guarantee us the White House in 2024. We can take back the House. It's not over. It's just 2 years. We get to do this again. In 2 years, we get to vote again for our Congress, and there'll be a certain number of senators that we'll be voting for as well. So we didn't win it all this time, but we will stay on the battlefield. We'll keep voting. We'll keep voting. My words to live by. We are going to just keep voting. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.